Welcome to Past People. Get ready for a roller coaster of a tale as we delve into the sad and intriguing life of King George I, the most hated monarch in British history. From family conflicts to dark secrets, George's reign was filled with drama, making him a controversial figure in the annals of British royalty. We'll explore King George I's tumultuous life, from his troubled childhood and strained family relationships to a questionable marriage and the mysterious disappearance of a rival. George's story takes unexpected turns, so buckle up for a journey into the complexities of power, love, and betrayal. King George I is remembered as the most disliked monarch in British history, and for good reason. George was sly, arrogant, and had a cruel streak that even his own family couldn't escape. His reign was full of turmoil, from rebellions to family conflicts, painting a bleak picture of his time as king. Born into power, but not in England, George I was the first son of German nobles. He was originally meant to inherit lands in the Holy Roman Empire from his father, Ernest Augustus. However, things didn't go as planned, leading to a troubled reign in Britain. Originally named George Ludwig, the German nobleman changed his name to George Rex during his coronation in England over 50 years later. This change was a response to the widespread condemnation of his foreign birth, a desperate attempt to win the support of his new subjects. George I and his brother Frederick Augustus were inseparable as children. However, this close bond only made their future rift more heartbreaking, adding to the misery of George's story. George's mother, Sophia of Hanover, fell ill when he was young, leading her to spend a year in warmer climates for recovery. The absence of a proper parenting during this time left a lasting impact on George. He developed a somber personality marked by introspection and sensitivity, which haunted his public image later in life. Despite showing promise as a leader, George's quiet nature and sense of responsibility as the eldest child created challenges. While praised by his mother for being dutiful and reliable, these traits had negative consequences as well, contributing to the overall misery of his life. Being the oldest child came with perks for George. His father, Ernest Augustus, gave him lots of attention and prepared him for a fancy life. They did things like hunting and riding together, and George learned all about living like an aristocrat. His siblings didn't get the same treatment, and his favoritism caused big problems. Besides the fun activities with his dad, George also had to face dangerous challenges. In the late 1600s, Europe was full of conflicts, and Ernest Augustus knew that his boys might have to fight. So during the Franco-Dutch War, he took the introverted 15-year-old George into battle. It's surprising George didn't end up more messed up from this experience. George was his father's favourite, and in 1683 his father declared that only George could inherit the relatives' lands. This caused a massive family feud, especially with his brother Frederick Augustus. The sibling rift grew over time, but George had bigger problems on the horizon. In 1682, George got engaged to Sophia Dorothea, his cousin. It wasn't a perfect match, though. George's mother worried about Sophia's lower social status, but George had a sneaky plan. George wasn't just in love with his cousin, he had a cunning reason to court her. Sophia's dowry promised more lands for George once they were married. He convinced his ambitious mother to approve the match, but soon everyone regretted it. After getting married, George and Sophia's relationship fell apart. Despite having 2 kids by 1687, they were completely estranged. George spent more time with his mistress than his wife, but it was a two-way street, and Sophia was no stranger to infidelity. Feeling neglected by George, Sophia had an affair with the Swedish Count Philip Christoph. This caused a major uproar. While George got away with his extramarital affairs, Sophia faced the royal family's disapproval, and things got even more interesting from here. George's wife had a strong connection with the Count, and the royal family worried that they might run away together, which would embarrass George. To avoid that, they pressured Sophia to break up with her lover. When she refused, things took a darker turn. In July 1694, George's problems with the Count conveniently vanished in a very violent way. The Count disappeared, and George was suspected to be behind it. Rumours suggested George's family paid people to harm the lover, either dumping his body in a river or burying him under the palace floorboards. George's true colours were showing, but he wasn't finished with his wife. Not content with the murder of Sophia's lover, George ended his marriage with her, claiming that she had abandoned him. Despite the irony, he went further. With her father's permission, George locked Sophia in the house, far from Hanover, showing his power over her. Sophia remained in royal prison for 30 years, with George denying her her basic rights. He forbade her from remarrying, going into town without supervision, and even kept her away from her own children. Once shy, George had become a harsh ruler, showing no signs of stopping. In a twist of fate, George became the heir to the English throne after locking up his ex-wife. Prince William, the current heir, died unexpectedly, causing a crisis. The Protestant English court overlooked many Catholic potential successors, and George, the next male Protestant in line, inherited the throne. However, it came at a cost. George's mother, Sophia of Hanover, was next in line for the crown, healthier than the current Queen Anne of England. However, Anne didn't want to lose the throne to Sophia and sent a harsh letter. Devastated, Sophia fell ill and eventually passed away. George gained a higher position in the Game of Thrones, but lost his beloved mother. Was it worth it? Spoiler, no. When Queen Anne passed away in 1714, George finally became the king at the age of 54. People called him Lucky George because they never expected this older German man to be their king. However, George's luck didn't last long, as challenges awaited him. Learning he was now the King of Great Britain, George didn't want to give up his easy life in Hanover. Instead of acting like a king, he partied across Europe. His delayed arrival in his new kingdom, coupled with his careless behaviour, did not sit well with the British people. When George finally arrived for his coronation, chaos erupted. Angry riots broke out across England, with people destroying things and causing bloody clashes. Many couldn't accept a foreigner as their king. George faced a humiliating welcome at Westminster Abbey. To the English, George seemed like a country bumpkin. As he approached the Abbey for his coronation, the angry crowd labelled him Turnip King. One protester was even detained for waving a turnip on a stick. George likely didn't understand the insults, mainly because of a crucial reason. During his coronation, things got awkward fast. George, who didn't speak English, struggled to grasp the ceremony's rituals. He relied on Latin and French, stumbling through the day with the help of his aides. When people learned that he couldn't understand their language, his reputation plummeted, and he did little to fix it. In addition to the language barrier, the British formed unflattering opinions about George based on German stereotypes. One belief claimed George accepted any woman who was willing, fat, and had a large breast. While this might have been gossip, some scandalous incidents at his coronation added fuel to the fire. On his coronation day, George's attention was split between two women, one very thin and the other more curvy. The crowd noticed this, calling them the elephant and the maypole. Gossip spread that the king's insatiable lust needed two partners. However, the truth about one woman was quite different. The curvier woman was George's half-sister, and despite the scandalous rumours, there was no romance between them. However, the thin woman was George's longtime mistress. Their relationship caused quite a stir. Though George and his mistress never married, everyone who knew him recognised her as his true love. They had 3 illegitimate children and stayed together throughout their lives. Future Prime Minister Robert Walpole even called her as much the Queen as there was ever, showing George needed all the allies that he could get. To ease tension, George surrounded himself with familiar faces in his new court. His closest aides were Turks that he had captured in battle. They kept English courtiers at bay, preventing them from taking important royal positions. However, this strategy didn't go as planned. As news about the new king spread in British high society, the gossip and laughter behind his back grew. George's secretive behaviour was misunderstood, and the English court labelled him with demeaning nicknames like Honest Blockhead, Corpulent Oaf, and King Log. The aristocracy was not impressed. George's reign in Britain was a humbling experience. Unlike in Hanover, he didn't have absolute control. Parliament had to approve most major changes, and this lack of control made George very uneasy and prone to making bad decisions. George wanted to go back to Hanover, but being king kept him away. He managed occasional visits, but spent a fifth of his rule on pleasure trips to his homeland. In the end, he might have needed to focus more on the throne. In the first year of George's rule, a big rebellion threatened his power. The Jacobites, a group from Scotland, tried to kick George out and make the son of King James II of England the new king. They even raised a small army, but luckily for George, they were defeated. You think this would make George look good, but nope. After stopping the rebellion, people were curious about what George would do next. Unfortunately, he made a big mistake. Instead of punishing the rebels, he decided to be merciful. While that's nice, it made his subjects think that he was weak, and the insults kept coming. George didn't handle this very well. Tired of all the mean comments, George started acting very unkingly. The reclusive king avoided being in public as much as possible. He sneaked around London in disguise for late-night card games and hid in the shadows during opera visits. His popularity took another hit. While George struggled socially, his son, George Augustus, thrived in British society. The younger man claimed to have no drop of blood that was not English. A lie, for sure, but a big problem for King George. Jealous of his son's popularity, King George tried to change his ways. In an unusual move, he started dining in public in 1717, sometimes with 50 guests. He tried to impress the British people by spending money in extravagant ways over the next few years. George spent most of his time at Hampton Court Palace in England, a historic estate. The palace already had many features, but George made crazy changes to outshine his son's popularity. He turned the Great Hall into a theatre and the tennis court into a grand assembly room. When that didn't impress enough, he tried another desperate measure. One calm summer evening, George I floated on the Thames River on a fancy boat with his courtiers. While on this pleasure cruise, German composer Handel played the water music suites. It was a luxurious moment, but with King George, there was always more going on than it seemed. The water music show was a big show-off move. Historians still argue about who came up with the idea. Some say George asked Handel to write it to boost his popularity. Another story claims Handel wrote it to mend their friendship after a falling out. But not all of George's fights got fixed. When George's son had a baby in 1717, the king was happy at first. Then things went bad. To help his son, the king picked Thomas Pelham Holles as a baptism sponsor. There was a big problem. The Prince of Wales didn't like Lord Chamberlain, and this led to a disaster. During the baby's christening, chaos erupted. The young father insulted the Lord Chamberlain, who took it as a challenge to a duel. King George's careful plans for his son blew up, and he didn't waste time throwing a tantrum. After the blow-up, King George kicked his son out of the palace. He went a step further. He kept his son and daughter-in-law from seeing their own kids for months, insisting the children stay with him. Like with his ex-wife, George I's revengeful side showed up, and there was no turning back. George's harsh punishment made his son desperate. One day, the son and his wife sneaked into the palace to catch a glimpse of their children. When they saw them, Caroline passed out, and the heir cried like a child. Although King George later made up, the damage was done. Over the next years, George Augustus grew angrier at his father. His London house became a base for the king's political rivals. Newspapers loved it, printing pages of royal family feud gossip and eagerly anticipating King George's death. But before that, a dangerous scandal unfolded. While George was in Hanover, his courtiers, including his mistress, caused a stock market crash in the South Sea bubble. It turned into a catastrophe. People blamed George for everything. Then things got deadly. As George rushed back to England, blame games got intense. In a heated debate, one of the king's allies, Lord Stanhope, collapsed and died of a heart attack. Eventually, the South Sea bubble calmed, but George had little to do with it. By then, the king was on to one last strange amusement. After the chaos from the market crisis settled, George sailed to Hanover to escape his problems. While hunting in Germany, he stumbled upon a feral child in the woods. Surviving without human contact, the boy's wild behavior surprised the hunting party. Despite the shock, the king felt sympathy for the child's inability to communicate. With his usual brilliant ideas, George brought the boy back to Britain, naming him Peter the Wild Boy. The king tried to improve his life by raising him with royal luxuries. Unfortunately, it turned disgraceful, and the boy became a mere spectacle at court. Despite facing public slander, George was open to different opinions, possibly because he didn't understand English very well. He supported free speech and offered refuge to the writer Voltaire when France threatened to imprison him in 1726. However, not all writers were the king's allies. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels humorized George's court. In the novel, George I is portrayed as the emperor of the tiny Lilliputian people, and political discussions are comically compared to the arguments over shoe height. You can't win them all. In 1760, longing for Hanover, George set out for his homeland, but never arrived. While enjoying strawberries in his royal coach, he suffered a sudden fit and never recovered. At the border of Germany, King George I passed away at 67 due to a stroke. Throughout his reign, George wished to be back in his native land, and after his death, he was buried in the chapel of Lane Palace in Hanover, becoming the last British monarch laid to rest overseas. When King George I died, people expected his son, King George II, to pay respects in Germany. Instead, he stayed in London, choosing England over his father. This revenge made him popular, and George Jr. finally won the popularity contest. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey into the life of King George I. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button, subscribe for more captivating historical content, and ring the notification bell to stay updated. The explosive life of George II, the aggressive monarch. In the tumultuous backdrop of 18th century Europe, King George II's life unfolded as a riveting saga, marked by swift romantic alliances, perilous battles, and close brushes with mortality. From a clandestine courtship that defied societal expectations to a royal heir's audacious foray into military affairs, George II's journey defied the conventions of his time. Join us as we delve into the explosive chapters of his life, revealing a monarch whose story unfolds like a captivating drama of love, war, and the relentless pursuit of power. While George II held the title of King of Great Britain, his true passion lay in engaging in battles rather than royal duties. His appetite for conflict extended even to clashes with his own family, concealing scandalous secrets behind palace doors. This monarch was not only a reverent lover and a formidable warrior, but also led a life filled with astonishing twists. Discover the intriguing life surrounding George II. Despite being one of Great Britain's longest reigning monarchs and an emblem of his era, King George II wasn't British by birth. Born in Hanover, Germany in 1683, this Teutonic ruler's noble parents instructed him in French as his primary language, aligning with the court's linguistic preference. However, this revelation about George and his family is merely the tip of the iceberg. George II hailed from a disgraced family, with his parents Sophia Dorothea and George Louis, known for their scandalous affairs. The breaking point occurred in 1692 when his mother's extramarital affair led to the dissolution of their marriage, casting her into imprisonment in a castle, a scandal that resonated throughout Europe. Despite never seeing his mother again, George II followed in her scandalous footsteps. Following his own disastrous marriage, George's father, George Louis, aimed to spare his son from a loveless, pre-arranged union. However, still reeling from scandal, he initiated political negotiations for George to marry Hedvig Sophia of Sweden. Little Georgie Porgy, however, had plans of his own. George vehemently opposed copying his parents, steering clear of a loveless marriage and potential royal scandal. While his father sought to arrange a union with Hedvig Sophia, George orchestrated a covert plan, demonstrating a level of cunning that would impress contemporary reality TV show writers. In June 1705, George executed his plan for true love with mission, impossible flair. Disguised as Monsieur de Buch, he infiltrated the court at Ansbach, employing a sophisticated disguise. His objective was to find genuine affection while assuming a false identity, a scheme that defied expectations and succeeded. Despite George's elaborate plan, one person saw through his disguise, Caroline of Ansbach. Recognizing the European royal beneath the mask, she unraveled the truth, making history in the process. George's infatuation with Caroline of Ansbach, whether as himself or Monsieur de Buch, became apparent. The feeling was reciprocated, with Caroline finding George undeniably handsome. However, the complexities of their relationship went beyond surface appearances. The love story between George and Caroline unfolded like an adult fairy tale, with Caroline being an orphan and George emerging as her clandestine, affluent Prince Charming. While their union had elements of enchantment, the tale did not conclude with a conventional happily ever after. The summer of 1705 in Germany witnessed a swift turn of events in George and Caroline's relationship. A mere month after their initial encounter in Ansbach, the couple had already formalized the details of their marriage contract, a truly romantic gesture. Just a month later, they sealed their union. However, the early days of their marriage faced considerable challenges and nearly reached an untimely end. Shortly after George and Caroline exchanged vows, tragedy struck. Following the birth of their first child, Caroline fell victim to smallpox. George, deeply devoted to his wife, stood vigil by their bedside throughout her illness. Yet this marked only the beginning of a harrowing ordeal. Proximity to his ailing wife resulted in George contracting the illness as well, and for a moment the future seemed perilous for the young couple, but both managed to survive the ordeal. George's affections extended beyond his beloved Caroline. He harboured a fervour for combat. The aspiring king possessed a keen interest in military strategy, defying his father's wishes by participating in the Battle of Oudenarde. While his marriage had already subjected him to the threat of smallpox, the subsequent battle posed an even greater danger. Emerging victorious in the Battle of Oudenarde didn't spare George from peril. He narrowly evaded death as his unit faced intense attacks, witnessing casualties on all sides. Even the colonel from his ranks perished during the confrontation. The situation escalated when George's horse succumbed to the chaos. Miraculously, George emerged unscathed, albeit not without a daring act. George's survival at the battle might have been more than mere luck. Some believed it to be a form of divine intervention. The Duke of Marlborough, who led the forces in the battle, commended the future King George II for distinguishing himself, charging at the head of the Hanoverian troops. This display of leadership elevated George's popularity. Queen Anne ruled over Great Britain at the time, lacking direct heirs. The succession plan designated her cousin, George Louis, George's father, as the heir to the throne upon her death. In 1714, Queen Anne passed away, paving the way for George Louis to become King George I. Meanwhile, our protagonist assumed the title of Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. However, these titles changes brought their own set of dangers. While representing his father during a royal engagement, George attended the Theatre Royal on Drury Lane. An unidentified assailant sought to accomplish what even battlefield adversaries couldn't, a premature end to George's reign. Despite the assailant managing to harm one individual in the attempt, George once again emerged unscathed. Unfortunately, this stroke of good fortune earned him a formidable adversary. Join us in part 2 as we look at the next chapter of George II's saga. The monarch's thirst for conflict leads him to the Prussian-Hanoverian border, where familial ties become strained as he faces off against his own brother-in-law, Frederick William I of Prussia. The refusal of a proposed duel and redirected family feuds, this time with his estranged son Frederick, showcased George II's complex relationships. His temporary return to Hanover, an ill-fated sea voyage, and the resilient monarch's efforts to uphold appearances amid health challenges weave a narrative of political intrigue, familial turmoil, and personal resilience that defines this intriguing phase of George II's reign. In the aftermath of a familial conflict and a series of tumultuous events, George II, the King of Great Britain, found himself embroiled in a new chapter marked by political manoeuvres, family discord, and personal challenges. The vacuum left by his father's absence propelled George II to seek excitement on the Prussian-Hanoverian border, inadvertently sparking a clash with his own family. As he navigated complex familial feuds, the king's decisions, from declining a duel to engaging in disputes with his estranged son Frederick, painted a portrait of a ruler grappling with both external and internal adversaries. The narrative unfolds with George II's return to his Hanoverian roots, a perilous sea voyage, and a resilient spirit determined to weather the storms, both figurative and literal, that define this phase of his reign. Emerging as the darling of the masses, George II defied the odds, surviving smallpox, military clashes, and an assassination attempt, all before reaching the age of 35. His seemingly invincible stature endeared him to the English public, but it ignited tensions with his father, the King of England, resulting in a strained relationship fraught with jealousy and mistrust. A master on the battlefield, George faced a different kind of conflict in the realm of politics. In a spiteful manoeuvre, his father appointed the Duke of Newcastle as a sponsor for George's second son, fully aware of George's disdain for the Duke. The strategic move led to a heated exchange of words at the baptism, ultimately escalating into a dual challenge, a confrontation that ended in turmoil for all parties involved. Transferring his marital inclinations to civilian life, George found himself at odds with his father, who, to quell potential hostilities, resorted to a disturbing solution. Prior to the scheduled duel, King George I confined and effectively locked up George and Caroline in their chambers, mirroring a dark familial history. The baptismal episode may have been a cunning ploy by the deceptive and envious father to sideline his son, setting the stage for even greater conflicts. Family disputes eclipsed George's battlefield experiences as King George I took drastic measures, banishing both George and Caroline from St. James's Palace entirely. In a cruel twist of fate, history repeated itself as the king followed the footsteps of earlier familial banishments. Echoing his childhood separation from his mother, George faced the heart-wrenching reality of being estranged from his own children. While banished from the palace, George II's father ensured custody of their offspring, causing immense distress to the royal couple. Driven by the agony of separation, George and Caroline staged a daring break-in at St. George's Palace to reunite with their children. The emotional reunion saw Caroline fainting and the typically resilient George breaking down, shedding tears of joy. Eventually, the king relented, allowing George to see his children once a week. Despite the desire to confront his father's cruelty, George, now the king, couldn't openly challenge him without risking treason. However, fate intervened when King George I passed away in June 1727, allowing George II the last laugh as he chose to defy tradition and did not attend his father's funeral. As George II ascended to the throne, he swiftly embraced the opulence lifestyle denied to him by his father. With unrestricted access to the kingdom, he indulged in an annual allowance of £800,000, equivalent to a staggering £100 million today, ushering in a reign marked by newfound luxuries and unforeseen challenges. Eager for a new source of excitement after his father's departure, George II, now lacking a familial adversary, disregarded court advice and initiated aggressive maneuvers along the Prussian-Hanoverian border. The thrill of battle was cooling, and George II was determined to make a personal affair. In an unexpected twist, George II found himself in conflict with his own family as he encroached upon the Prussian-Hanoverian border, where the ruler happened to be none other than his brother-in-law and first cousin, Frederick William I of Prussia. Despite the familial ties, an additional motive fueled George II's contentious actions. The clash between George II and Frederick William I escalated, both being formidable fighters unwilling to back down. The tension grew so intense that diplomats proposed a duel to resolve the matter and avert an all-out war, presenting a surprising turn of events for a king known for his love of combat. Displaying unexpected restraint, George II declined the duel, recognizing the strategic wisdom in acknowledging defeat. The looming conflict with Frederick William I, dubbed the Soldier King by his subjects, prompted George II to re-evaluate his approach, even though occasional fits of frustration persisted. Unable to engage in a battle with his brother-in-law, George II redirected his familial feud towards his estranged son, Frederick. While George II had been entangled in disputes with his own father in England, his relationship with Frederick soured further during the son's upbringing in the Hanoverian court. By the time father and son reunited in England after 14 years, they shared little in common except for a penchant for familial discord. Despite being the King of Great Britain, George II's Hanoverian roots beckoned, leading him to visit his homeland in 1736. The decision to temporarily abandon his English subjects stirred discontent, forcing George to hastily plan his return amid mounting dissatisfaction. Eager to appease his subjects, George II set sail for England without checking the weather conditions, unwittingly sailing into a formidable winter storm in the English Channel. The ill-fated journey unfolded as a disaster for the king, revealing his lack of seafaring prowess. Weeks passed without any word of George II or his ship, sparking rumours among his subjects that he had succumbed to the wintry tempest. Contrary to expectations, the resilient king emerged from the shore a month later, albeit not entirely unscathed. Following his miraculous return, George II withdrew from public view, his health compromised by the taxing voyage, resulting in a fever and a painful case of hemorrhoids. Meanwhile, rumours spread by his son, Frederick, painted a bleak picture of the king's condition, underestimating King II's resilience. Aware of his son's ambitions for the throne, King George II, familiar with his father-son conflicts, defied rumours of his impending demise. Despite illness, he attended a social event, showcasing a determined effort to maintain appearances amid the ongoing familial strife. Join us in part 3 to discover the concluding chapters of George II's eventful reign, where familial discontent, health challenges, and unusual final wishes shape the monarch's legacy. In these entries, we explore George II's complex relationships with his children, witnessing his aversion to some and yearning for others to fade away. The narrative also unfolds the decline in the king's health, culminating in a peculiar end, marked by a poignant yet unconventional desire to reunite with his departed wife in the afterlife. As we delve into the concluding chapters of George II's tumultuous reign, we witness a complex tapestry of familial dynamics, health challenges, and peculiar final wishes. Despite harbouring mixed sentiments towards his children and experiencing the grief of losing some, George II grapples with both familial disputes and personal health issues. The narrative culminates with a peculiar twist in his last wishes, offering a glimpse into the ideas of a monarch whose life, marked by love, strife, and resilience, unfolds in an intriguing finale. Frederick, disappointed by his father's survival, sought to inflict emotional pain by banning George II and Caroline from witnessing the birth of their first grandchild. However, in a cruel twist, it would be George II who ultimately had the last laugh. George II, intolerant of his son Frederick's defiance, mirrored his own father's actions by banishing Frederick from the royal palace. The familial discord showcased the persistence of patterns through generations. Amidst the family strife, tragedy struck as George II's beloved wife, Caroline of Ansbach, succumbed to a prolonged and agonizing battle with a strangulated bowel. The typically strong-minded king, deeply in love with his Caroline, displayed an unexpected tenderness that observers had not seen before. In her final moments, Caroline urged George II to remarry, but the king, refusing to commit to matrimony again, declared his intent to have mistresses instead. This unusual vow added a touch of the unexpected to an otherwise poignant farewell. Despite his profound love for Caroline, George II, a true reflection of his parents, engaged in multiple affairs throughout his marriage. Surprisingly, he kept Caroline informed about these liaisons, and some even had potential consequences that reached beyond mere infidelity. George II's enduring affair with Hanoverian noblewoman Amalie von Warmoden spanned nearly 3 decades and possibly resulted in offspring. While some speculate that one of Amalie's sons could have been George II's prodigy, the king never acknowledged the child. As George II navigated the complexities of his personal life, his son Frederick hatched a devious plan to undermine his father. Following Caroline's passing, Frederick conspired with George II's political opponents, yet his grand coup never materialized. George II's remarkable luck persisted as Frederick, his scheming son and political adversary, passed away unexpectedly from what historians believe to be a pulmonary embolism. The unexpected turn of events shifted the political landscape for George II. Amidst recovering from the grief of his son's demise, George II faced another devastating loss as his daughter, Louisa, passed away later that same year. The accumulating tragedies painted a picture of a challenging period in George II's life, with one loss in particular leaving him less mournful than others. George II harboured a strong aversion not only towards his eldest son Frederick, but seemingly spread his disdain evenly among his children. Reflecting on the untimely deaths of his offspring, Louisa and Frederick, George II candidly admitted, "I know I did not love my children when they were young. I hated to have them running into my room, but now I love them as well as most fathers." The sincerity of this sentiment raises eyebrows given his historical track record. Soon, George II found himself yearning for another one of his sons to vanish from his life permanently. Specifically, he grew increasingly wary of his third son, the Duke of Cumberland, who had committed the crime of negotiating a peace treaty displeasing to George II. According to the king, Cumberland had ruined me and disgraced himself. After more than 3 decades on the throne, marked by love, feuds, and numerous close calls, George II's life took a toll on his health. Suffering from blindness in one eye and hearing loss, the aging monarch still managed to savour life's pleasures, including a morning cup of hot chocolate. George II, an early riser, started the day as usual on the 25th of October 1760, sipping hot chocolate and attending to his morning routines. Little did he know that this day would be fateful. If he had foreseen the events that unfolded, he might have added an extra marshmallow to his morning indulgence. George II's demise unfolded into a humiliating manner. Shortly after retiring to his chambers, a loud sound alarmed his valet, who discovered the king on the floor. The physician's account noted the king appeared to have just come from his necessary stool, painting a vivid picture of his final moments. Assisted by attendants, George II was lifted into bed, and his daughter, Princess Amelia, was summoned. Tragically, by the time she arrived, the king had already passed away, leaving specific instructions for the disposition of his royal remains, a poignant gesture in its own way. George II's last wish was unconventional. He yearned to reunite with his departed wife in the afterlife. Specifically, he requested burial beside her with a peculiar twist. The sides of their coffins should be removed to allow their remains to mingle, as an unusual expression of enduring love. In the grand finale, George II's legacy appears to lean more towards being a lover than a fighter, excluding, of course, his conflicts with his father, brother-in-law, sons, and his involvement in actual battles. Regardless, history regards George II with a certain kindness, as one source notes. His character would not afford subject for epic poetry, but will look well in the sober page of history. In the wake of George II's passing, his legacy became an integral thread woven into a rich tapestry of British history. The ritual surrounding his death, from the post-mortem revelation of thoracic aortic dissection to the symbolic gesture of intermingling coffins, underscored the profound impact of his reign. As the nation mourned and reflected on the cynical nature of monarchy, George II's departure became a poignant chapter, reminding all of the transient nature of power and the enduring legacy left by those who once occupied the throne. The sad life of King George III, the king who lost everything. Meet King George III, the unhappy king, the man who lost America and even Farmer George. His reign, far from boring, was a tumultuous journey filled with scandals that culminated in a truly tragic ending. Was he a true villain or a scapegoat for all? Join us as we delve into the sorrowful tale of King George III and let you be the judge. The Americans saw him as their enemy, and even his own people joined in the criticism. When George III was born, it caused fear and panic. As the firstborn son to Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, he arrived 2 months early, and his birth order was the least of his family's worries at that moment. Due to high infant mortality, George's parents feared for his life and soul. The Bishop of Oxford baptized him on the same day as his birth, fearing that he might not survive the night. Against the odds, he seemed to be pulling through. Did his troubled entry into the world foretell a dark reign? If you believe in omens, the answer is a definite yes. George's survival was a miracle, especially when his father Frederick faced disdain with his own family. King George II and Frederick's mother loathed him, as suspicion surrounded Augusta's pregnancy. George III entered a tense family dynamic that only worsened over time. Despite his family's low opinion, Prince Frederick was a good father to George III, providing a quality education. George III was the first king to study science. However, the king didn't show much interest in the boy, and that was about to change suddenly. In his teen years, a tragedy shook George's life, the sudden death of his father, Prince Frederick. Now fatherless, George became the next in line for the throne, intensifying the battle between his mother and extended family for control. George experienced a custody battle of sorts, but on a royal scale. His grandfather wanted him at St. James's Palace, while his mother, with Lord Bute, fought to keep him close. Others also fought for George's affection in this tumultuous family struggle. At a point when a young king typically looks for romance, George found himself drawn to the ladies. Unlike his father and grandfather, who were known for their romantic escapades, George took love very seriously. When he spotted Lady Sarah Lennox, a noted beauty at court, he fell head over heels, but it didn't turn out very well. Upon hearing a rumour about Lady Sarah and the Duke of Marlborough, George sank into deep depression, spending hours alone in his room and losing sleep. Despite being only 21, he acted like a troubled teenager. Seeking advice from his mother's advisor, Lord Bute, George didn't get the support that he hoped for. Lord Bute warned George that marrying Lady Lennox wouldn't be good for the country. Whether it was true or not, George followed the advice. This decision left him heartbroken and raised questions among Lord Bute's influence. King George II was shaken by these events, and a new battle emerged among George's closest allies, each fighting to choose his wife. The battle was cut short by a tragic event. In 1760, King George II suddenly passed away, leaving George III as the last man standing at the age of 22. While he no longer dealt with his grandfather and mother's fractions, he remained vulnerable to those who sought to control him. Being single and in need of an heir, King George III had to act quickly. Initially considering a return to Lady Sarah Lennox with newfound agency, George's actions alarmed Lord Bute, who feared losing his influence. To secure his position, Lord Bute presented George with potential German brides, and surprisingly, it worked. Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, considered plain and unremarkable, emerged as an unexpected choice for queen. George III, running out of time, proposed immediately due to her suitable background and lack of political motives. Their union, however, held a surprising twist. In 1761, Princess Charlotte arrived in London, realising she would not only meet King George III for the first time, but also marry him immediately. Overwhelmed, she fainted. Revived by her attendants, a bewildered Charlotte met her future husband, botching the introduction and starting their relationship on a less than ideal note. It was too late to turn back, so everyone pretended to be brave and hoped for the best. Charlotte put on a charming act that night and won George's heart. They got married later, turning their shared nightmare into a kind of fairy tale. Charlotte impressed not only George, but everyone at the end of the night was praising her. However, there was one person who remained hard to please. George's mother, Dowager Princess Augusta, had married his father hoping to become queen someday. That dream slipped away, but she still had her son. Well, she sensed trouble when he fell for Charlotte, so she started acting like a seriously mean mother-in-law. Augusta couldn't control her son, but she did everything to undermine her daughter-in-law. She even placed spies among the Queen's attendants, but her power-hungry ways would soon backfire. Scandals quickly surfaced in George III's reign. Shortly after his coronation, he faced embarrassing rumours about his mother. When Lord Bute became Prime Minister, people started whispering about an affair between him and Princess Augusta. The court was shocked, dealing the first but not the last blow to George's trust in the man that he had relied on the most, as if he didn't have enough to deal with. George III took the throne at a challenging time. Britain was in the middle of the 7 Years' War, an enormous conflict. Initially accepted by Parliament, George faced opposition when his friend Lord Bute became Prime Minister. The rumours about Lord Bute and his mother damaged George's relationship with the Prime Minister, but if he wanted to escape the trouble, they had to work together. By 1763, the war was draining Britain, but the French were in worse shape. Talks of peace began, with leniency towards opponents in Spain and France. There was just one issue. Many saw it as a weakness, even a betrayal by the king and Lord Bute. In a terrifying incident, an angry mob attacked the king's carriage. Still, Britain had to end things, luckily with an advantage. The end of the 7 Years' War was a triumph for Great Britain. Gaining territories including parts of North America, it marked the era when Great Britain was famously called a vast empire, on which the sun never sets. Initially, England's American colonists celebrated the victory, but things changed. As we wrap up the sad life of George III, Part 1, the king who lost everything, we ponder the legacy of a monarch whose rule was marred by family strife, political intrigue, and personal tragedy. The Americans deemed him their enemy, and criticism abounded from his own people. Was King George III a victim of circumstance, or did he play a part in his own downfall? The answers are elusive, leaving us with a poignant tale of a monarch who faced the harsh realities of power and paid the price. Great Britain's win gave American colonists more land to use, but part of this grand empire, they wanted even more. When George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, limiting settlers and protecting Native American land, the colonists flipped out. They felt betrayed, and trouble was brewing for George III. Lord Bute was a close friend of George for a very long time, but the government troubles took a toll on their relationship. In 1763, Bute resigned. Despite George's mother trying to patch things up, it didn't work. Out of sight, Lord Bute faded away, making the king the blame for many decisions Bute had made. This wasn't the last time a prime minister messed things up for him. To recover lost money and deal with conflicts in the US, George III and the next Prime Minister, George Grenville, introduced the 1765 Stamp Act. It caused a huge uproar and controversy. The act put taxes on printed materials in the colonies, seen as a personal attack. The colonies were furious, and once again the king was in trouble. After lots of conflict, George III reluctantly agreed to repeal the Stamp Act. While the colonies celebrated, even putting up a statue of him in New York City, it would come back to haunt him. George did well in one aspect of his reign, having kids. After marrying Charlotte, they had a whopping 15 children, almost all surviving to adulthood. It was extraordinary for royals at that time, and despite a shaky start, George III and Charlotte made things work. They genuinely loved each other and had produced heirs. Yet the stresses of his reign were taking a toll on George. In 1765, King George faced a mysterious mental disorder. His mother and her allies closely watched over the sick king, hiding the full extent of his illness from his wife, poor Queen Charlotte. The worried queen was often found crying throughout the palace. Suddenly, he recovered out of nowhere. Things returned to normal, but for George, normal meant tension, strife, and drama. Even though he had a happy family at home, George's extended family was far from joyful. George was a pretty serious guy, religious, and unlike his predecessors, he didn't have mistresses. However, his brothers followed family traditions of affairs and secret marriages that the king disapproved of. George tried to pass a law preventing royal family members from marrying without the king's approval. It was another failed attempt to hold power that only undermined confidence in the king. As things spiraled out of control, George still trusted the parliamentary government, and here's where it backfired. Tensions rose in the colonies, and subjects were tired of paying taxes without representation. In a big mistake, George said, "Forget about everything, except the duty on tea." Well, maybe not those exact words, but it really angered the colonists. British people don't joke about tea. The British saw the Boston tea protests and tea destruction as vicious and unlawful. Before, tensions mostly existed in the colonies, but now it was mutual. George's role painted him as a tyrant, and the colonies were ready to revolt. You might know the next part. 13 colonies were fed up with Britain and fought back. In July 1776, they declared independence, blaming George for abandoning governance in America. The American Revolutionary War began, and chances are you know how it went for George. George III tried to rally his inexperienced ministers for a civil conflict, but then France joined, making things worse. While the colonies had allies worldwide, Britain only had loyalists. Everything was falling apart before George's eyes, and it was about to get much worse. George's ministers begged to quit the impossible job that they faced. There was a fear that the colonies' allies might invade England. With little power left, George gathered 7,000 men to cross the Atlantic, but it was too little, too late. After many losses, George had no choice but to accept defeat. It tarnished his entire legacy, but first he had to deal with the aftermath. After losing America, the British Parliament was in chaos. It went through many prime ministers until George put his foot down. Through manoeuvring, he got an ally, William Pitt the Younger, as PM. Pitt was the youngest Prime Minister of Great Britain at just 24. Despite some minor parliamentary issues, George finally had one of his own where he wanted him. Considering the storm ahead, he would need him. Surprisingly, the people of Great Britain liked the combo of Pitt and George. Pitt was energetic and subjects appreciated him as a family man. There was a more tragic reason for their warmth. King and Queen lost 2 sons in 1782 and 1783. Prince Alfred was 1 and Prince Octavius 3. The loss weighed heavily on George, adding to his fragile health, and soon everything fell apart. In the summer of 1788, King George had another breakdown, and this time it was much worse. He spent much of that period in a manic state, locking his wife and daughters in a room and talking for hours. They convinced him to go to Cheltenham Spa to recuperate, but sadly it didn't help. When he returned home, things got even worse. By November 1788, George's mental state worsened. He talked for hours, foaming at the mouth and dehydrated. Sometimes repeating himself, he got more creative and used a wider vocabulary in other episodes. There was even a tale of him introducing himself to a tree, thinking it was the King of Prussia. His family struggled to keep it a secret, but someone within their ranks was plotting. One doctor visited the king without speaking to Queen Charlotte, alerting her to a devastating truth. Someone was trying to cut her off from her husband. Tragically, her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, was behind it. He suspected Charlotte wanted the throne, while she feared he might have his father declared insane for his accession. While the power struggle unfolded, doctors struggled to help the king. In that era, doctors knew little about mental disorders, leaving them clueless on how to help the king. Their chosen treatment was disturbing. They forcibly restrained him until he calmed down, using caustic mixtures to balance his evil humours, and even practiced bloodletting. It was agonizing, and if he knew what happened while incapacitated, it would have shattered him even more. During George's struggles, Parliament struggled to find a solution. The king's eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, was 26 and ambitious. Charles James Fox argued the prince should act as regent, but Pitt, who clashed with the boy, suggested that Parliament chose a regent. Just as Fox and the prince were about to succeed, a surprise changed everything. King George recovered suddenly, returning to his post. He and the Prime Minister Pitt worked together successfully, gaining immense popularity. This frustrated Fox and the Prince of Wales, who had turned against his father. King George seemed more in control of both power and mental faculties than ever, causing them more irritation. People liked George because he showed sympathy for the mentally ill. 3 attackers targeted him between 1786 and 1800. Each were mentally unstable. King George shocked everyone with his leniency and understanding, especially since the attacks weren't political. After one assault, he was so unfazed that he even fell asleep. However, his life wasn't without stress. For every success, like signing the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1809, King George dealt with tribulations like the French Revolution. Initially, European countries denounced the revolutionaries, but they eventually left Great Britain opposing France and Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a situation akin to a swarm of mosquitoes on a humid day. Many expected Napoleon to invade, causing months of looming threat. The French trouble even strained George's alliance with William Pitt. The stress led to brief relapses of his mental illness, yet he managed to outlast even the most unexpected foes. In the midst of power struggles, Pitt returned to power around the time George recovered. Pitt tried to include Fox, but George rejected the idea, leading to a spectacular backfire. Many in Parliament saw it as unfair and turned against the king. Other political battles took their toll on everyone. William Pitt died at 46 and Charles James Fox followed 9 months later. Against all odds, George was once again the last man standing, but you can't cheat fate forever. After losing one ally and one foe, King George found himself standing alone, mostly in opposition to men in government. He was at the height of his popularity when tragedy struck. In November 1810, George lost his youngest and most beloved child, Princess Amelia. She died after a long battle with measles at just 27. Everything began to unravel for King George at this very moment. Shortly after losing his daughter, George experienced a brutal betrayal. One of his supporters and Amelia's closest friends mismanaged his position, owing the crown £250,000. Disgraced, he attempted to blackmail the king and queen, threatening to expose Amelia's letters. It added insult to the injury of losing his daughter, and the rest of his children didn't exactly help. After all these stresses, King George's health declined once again, dealing with deteriorating mental health, cataracts that left him nearly blind, and a painful case of rheumatism. The loss of his daughter was a crushing blow. King George III grieved intensely for his daughter, with tears and a constant sense of melancholy. As he lost his mind, his grief took a disturbing form. He made heartbreaking pleas for Amelia, begging for her presence in bouts of insanity. At other times, George spoke to her as if she was in the room, or claimed that she was visiting family in Hanover. George III, his court, government, and family were at a loss. There was a moment where recovery seemed possible, but the king knew deep down that the loss of Amelia had broken him forever. In 1811 he faced it, signing an act naming his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, as regent. He had given up on his reign, but his story wasn't over yet. With their father in a powerless state and their mother focused on caregiving, the rest of George's family slowly drifted apart. The princesses, having lived through a nightmarish ordeal, distanced themselves from their parents. The Prince of Wales provided each princess with an estate, and they gladly accepted. Queen Charlotte found herself alone with her mentally unstable husband, and it was far from a pleasant situation. Unfortunately, tending to the king and occasionally assisting the Prince of Wales as regent took a toll on Charlotte's health. In 1818 she passed away at 74, surrounded by her children. Although King George was still holding on, the loss of his favourite daughter had already shattered him, and the Queen's death had a devastating impact. As his wife was gone, the king descended further into madness. Without Charlotte's care, his decline accelerated. In a tragic irony, the king never grasped that Charlotte was gone forever. His deteriorating mind couldn't comprehend that his wife would never be by his side again. George himself followed her 2 years later, passing away in 1820 as a mere shadow of his former self. It was a truly sorrowful conclusion to their tumultuous story, yet lingering questions remained about the rapid and dramatic deterioration of the king's health. In the years after King George III's death, as medical understanding of mental illness improved, speculation arose about the cause of his peculiar bouts of mania. Some suggested porphyria, a genetic blood disorder common among royals. Others discussed bipolar disorder as a potential culprit. But then a new possibility emerged. For centuries, the true cause of King George's health issues remained uncertain until 2005, when scientists analysed his hair. The testing revealed an unexpectedly high level of arsenic. Arsenic could potentially explain his bouts of mania. The mystery deepened. Did he accidentally encounter it, or was he intentionally poisoned? The answer remains elusive, leaving behind a historical puzzle that intrigues those seeking to unravel the truth.